Welcome back to the next episode of TMT with Mike O'Reilly. My guest is Joe Kane, and I want to get this correctly, the Director for Broadband and Spectrum Policy at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation.
It's a mouthful.
Did I get that right? It's
a
mouthful.
That's correct. Yeah.
Well, let's start with an easy question if we can. What was your background? What led you to ITIF?
Yeah. So my background starts with being an undergrad poli-sci major, as so many people in DC. And then just the internship I got in DC was working on telecom policy. And so I kind of just dug into that. My boss, my first day, gave me Ronald Coase's FCC article about auctioning spectrum, and I got really into that. It was also in 2015 when there was high drama around net neutrality, so an exciting time to be involved in broadband and spectrum policy then, and sort of kept going down that road. That then led me to doing a master's degree in economics, working in another think tank for a bit, and then realizing everyone in this field has a law degree, so I went to law school, and then right after law school here at ITIF. So that brings us up to the present day, I think.
Okay. Tell us a little bit of ITIF, and then is there a difference or some understanding, how does it interact with ITIC?
Yeah. So we actually don't have a relationship with ITIC. We have a similar name, but I think that's about it. They are sort of a trade association. We're a think tank, so we have our own views on things. ITIF doesn't have members. We are a think tank working on, I guess I work on broadband and spectrum, but more broadly we're looking at productivity and innovation and how we can have policies that best advance that from specifically a US perspective, but also a global perspective on how we can be increasing innovation and productivity. I like that ITIF is sort of technology policy focused, and then we have a lot of specialization within that. Other think tanks sometimes have a tech department, and then there is one person who has to deal with all this different stuff. I'm not the AI guy, I'm not the life sciences guy, but we have people who are very specialized and know a lot more about all those things than I do.
Outstanding. So, and looking at your writings and your commentary, one of the focuses has been on broadband subsidies, different programs that the federal government has established, many programs.
Yeah.
Perhaps what's most of mind to people these days is the BEAD program, or the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program. Hope they got that right. The BEAD program, $42 billion that's going to go out of NTIA. And this administration has made some changes to that program going forward. Can you give us a flavor of what BEAD is, and then what are the changes that the Trump administration has made?
Yeah. So BEAD is the biggest broadband funding program we've ever had, $42 billion, like you said. And it has the potential to be a program that can go a really long way to closing the digital divide. The changes that were made were to sort of refocus it on a lot of the original program under the Biden administration had a lot of extraneous requirements that had nothing to do with broadband, and so it stripped away a lot of those. I think the biggest changes, the most important changes that it made, though, were on the technology neutrality and picking lower cost deployment options. So the original program had a big thumb on the scale for fiber deployments and said if you're running a bidding process for these subsidy dollars, if someone comes to you with an end-to-end fiber project, you basically have to pick that unless it's exorbitantly expensive. But states were defining that where we ended up having $77,000 per location be deemed that's not too expensive, where fiber wins at that price. And so the new rules come in and say, you don't get to put a big thumb on the scale for fiber. Consumers don't really care what technology they're getting their broadband connection with. They want it to work. They want high-speed, reliable, scalable connections. And so it redefines what a priority broadband project is based on the capabilities of your connection, not by the technology that's delivering them. And then it said states, when you're rerunning your bidding process, this benefit of the bargain round to say, how are we going to decide which ISPs get the money? You should pick the lowest cost, the most cost-effective option that meets these requirements. And I think that makes a lot of sense, to say that if we have multiple options that can all provide reliable high-speed broadband, then you should pick the cheapest one. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I think one of the primary ones is that the digital divide is not really a deployment problem anymore. We have broadband deployed almost everywhere in the country. The people who aren't online are more often not online because of affordability or lack of interest or lack of skills or something like that. And the more money we send into deployment through all these different government programs, the less money we have to address those bigger problems.
So one of the loudest critics of the changes to BEAD has been the fiber industry. How do you respond to their argument that the fiber is the gold standard and everyone who doesn't get fiber is an inferior technology and they're going to suffer a fate? It's the only technology for the future kind of scenario. How do you respond to that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think fiber is a great technology. I think that when fiber is cost effective, it's certainly the highest capacity technology that we have out there. But it also is a level of capacity that is far above what anyone is using on a daily basis. We've done some work looking at, say, like a Zoom call or something, which is probably one of the higher bandwidth things that your average internet user does on a daily basis. That requires about 3 megabits per second up and down. A 4K video from Netflix, you're probably looking at more like 15 megabits per second up and down. So these sort of gigabit speeds that you get with fiber are some things that you're never ever hitting. So that's not to say that we shouldn't deploy fiber anywhere. It's just to say that we have these other technologies that can hit 100 megabits per second download, 20 megabits per second upload. Those are far more than your average consumer is using at any given time. And so it's sort of nonsensical to say we're going to spend on the most expensive, albeit highest capacity, but the most expensive technology when we have cheaper technologies that can, from a consumer's perspective, deliver the same experience.
What are your biggest concerns with the reformatted BEAD or BEAD in general? What are your concerns? Are you worried that some states won't complete the job, that there'll still be unserved populations? Or is there a concern over the lag time between when households will actually be connected? What worries you as you look at BEAD going forward?
Yeah, I think the biggest worry would be that we don't actually end up addressing the biggest causes of the digital divide with it. The NTIA's data says that deployment is 3% of the digital divide right now. And the lack of interest, I think, is about 55%, and affordability is like 15%. And then if we end up with a program that just addresses deployment, even if it does so really well, then we failed. We still are going to have to, states coming back saying we still have a digital divide in our state, we need more money, that kind of thing. That's part of the reason why we think that lowering deployment costs is really important, so that we can turn to those more pressing issues. And I think that there are concerns even under the current program, as we're starting to get preliminary results filtering out from the states, that maybe some states are trying to smuggle back in the fiber preferences by the back door. I think NTIA needs to be vigilant for that, and then say we really do mean it when we say be technology neutral, and then choose a reasonable cost option. I also think that I have concerns from NTIA's side, though, that they have not said what's going to become of so-called non-deployment funds. To say when you have leftover money, that's the benefit of having lower deployment costs, is that there's more money than you need to complete deployment. We think that's great because you can then repurpose that money for non-deployment uses like affordability, like adoption. But NTIA has not actually released its guidance to tell states, here's what you're allowed to do and here's how you do it. And if they try to do things like, claw the money back and just say we're going to keep it, then you end up with a program that has not addressed those big causes of the digital divide, and I think that would be a big concern.
Is there some concern that there's been an argument from some of the states that don't bother worrying about the leftover money, we'll take care of it. The statute's broad enough and we can handle the issue. Mm-hmm. Or should there be this role for NTIA to make sure that any leftover funds are spent properly, or not only consistent with the statute, but also will be beneficial to some of the purposes you spoke about?
Yeah, I think that I think there's definitely an NTIA oversight role for this entire program. Certainly the statute does list permissible uses of the funds, and one of those uses is broadband adoption programs. And so insofar as states are doing that, then they are operating within the statute. Ultimately, I think the money is going to flow through NTIA, so at some point there's going to be a clash where if a state wants to do something that NTIA doesn't want it to do, we have to decide who wins in that conflict. And I also think that there's room for NTIA to have some oversight on what does a good version of these programs look like. I think there was a lot of legitimate criticisms of the Affordable Connectivity Program, for example, that maybe it was too broad in its eligibility requirements and that kind of thing, that NTIA could come in and say, hey, states, here's what we think is a better version of that program. And if you want to set up your own sort of affordability voucher program, here's what we think would be a good version of that and the one that we would approve, that kind of thing. But right now, what we're hearing from NTIA is basically nothing. That they in the deployment guidance they put out, they said, we're canceling everyone's non-deployment programs, and we'll give you guidance later. And so, later is now here, and I think we should be wanting to move ahead with those non-deployment.
Is there a formula where you can pay for all the deployment issues and then have a pretty good chunk of change where more than necessary for the non-deployment functions, and still be able to achieve some arguments from some conservatives that money should go back to the Treasury? Can you accomplish all three goals with $42 billion, something we've never seen as you referenced before?
Yeah, I'm definitely open to seeing how we can divide up the money. I think that one concern I have is the incentive side for the states, that if you're trying to claw the money back and have it go back into the Treasury or deficit reduction or something like that, then you do end up in a situation where states, if you don't spend it, it's gone. You don't get the benefit of it. And so obviously there's a role for NTIA oversight to say don't have this sort of waste, fraud, and abuse going on. But it's tougher to do that when the states have an incentive to make the money disappear.
Interesting. How do you see BEAD fitting together with other large broadband subsidy programs, whether it be universal service at the FCC, Reconnect at the Department of Agriculture, or other money that's been, COVID money that's been sloshing around for quite a long while? Mm-hmm. How do you see BEAD fitting in there?
Yeah, I think that BEAD should be the program that completes the deployment part of the digital divide. That we have all these deployment programs that have been spending billions and billions of dollars year after year after year, and still saying, oh, we just need a few billion more, and then we can connect everybody. BEAD is supposed to be a program that connects everybody. So once we have, with the BEAD program done, I think it's time to sunset these sort of the high cost, Reconnect, all these other programs that are for rural broadband deployment, and say, okay, look, the deployment piece, really important. It's been the main priority of broadband policy for a really long time, but also we've succeeded. So we need to take yes for an answer and say, we have universal deployment. Now let's turn to whether or not that service is affordable, whether or not people have the skills to access it.
So does it make sense to, which I think the FCC has done, put deployment on the back burner or wait until BEAD is done? Reconnect hasn't kind of done that. Mm-hmm. How does Reconnect fit with BEAD? There has always been this argument made by many that they kind of serve their own masters and kind of go in different directions on the same time purpose.
Yeah, I think that there has not been enough communication and coordination across the federal government on this. GAO, it seems like every other year or something comes out with a report that says, hey, look, it seems like every agency in the government has their own broadband subsidy program. It would be a good idea to maybe get all these together and try to coordinate and see what are we actually trying to accomplish and how well are we doing at it. And yeah, it doesn't seem like that's really happening right now, and saying we need to reevaluate our priorities at least, and after be deprioritizing the deployment side of things is the way we should be going.
One of the interesting, that critiqued by many was the Biden administration's goal of imposing what I would argue, and many people would say, is rate regulation as part of the BEAD dollars. Why is broadband constantly attacked for the rate side? What is the interest from outside groups and policymakers? Broadband has been one of the best economic costs for consumers for almost a decade, maybe 2 decades now, and yet it's maligned for compared to inflation or compared to whatever, it's been really beneficial. But critics still argue that it needs to be lower or needs to be free. What is the end goal of the constant barrage on rates? Yeah,
I know it's baffling to me as well that this is a thing, a service that has gotten better and better, and even compared to inflation, the price is falling. I think there's a couple things going on. One of them is probably that a lot of people don't like their ISP. I don't particularly love my ISP either, when you're waiting on hold with them. And so there's sort of political hate to be made by saying, we're going to go after these guys and make sure that you pay them less money. I also think that there's a side of it that is, especially on the political left, the idea that if something's really important, then it should be more regulated, and that's how you protect something that's really important. And I think that gets things a little bit backwards when you look at sort of how prices go in different industries. It's the industries that are more regulated that end up having higher prices, that costs mushroom, that kind of thing. I look at the broadband marketplace and COVID, where we had a huge increase in demand overnight, and so much private investment had gone into these things because we didn't have regulated rates that ISPs were able to basically handle that. You look in Europe, where there was a lot more regulation, and you had the ISPs saying, we got to throttle down on Netflix because we just don't have the capacity for it. So I think that there is sort of a backwards economic way of thinking about that, where people say that because we think it's really important, therefore the government should be really involved in it. And I don't think that's really how it works in practice. And then there's a third thing, which is that it is true that there are a decent number of people for whom broadband is not affordable. And so when you have a really important service that you want everyone to be able to use, then it comes to mind to say, well, why don't we just make the price lower? And I think that is counterproductive in a lot of ways too, that you both there's always going to be, no matter how low your regulated rate is, there's always going to be someone who can't afford it. That's why we've sort of looked at affordability from this sort of voucher side and said, let's find the people who need help affording broadband and give them a voucher to make a market rate service more affordable to them, rather than saying we're going to lower, regulate rates across the board and therefore, be giving cheaper service than we need to rich people, which also then erodes the same revenues that have been contributing to developing the broadband networks that we have today. I like the stat that there have private ISPs have invested the equivalent of 2 BEADs a year since the adoption of the IIJA, which enacted BEAD. That there's this is where the money that is creating high capacity networks is coming from. It's not coming from government regulation or even government subsidies.
So talk a little bit more about affordability. How do you envision, you've mentioned the voucher support that that ITIEF has had. How do you envision that as compared to something like ACP? Do you have different parameters you would use, or what would be an ideal program, and is there a size that you're comfortable with? Yeah.
So we think that ACP was kind of like a good general structure for a program. I think that there were valid criticisms that the 200% of the federal poverty level being the eligibility threshold was too broad. I think we ended up with 40% or something of the country was eligible for ACP, and that meant that it just ran out of money really quickly. It's in some ways was a vestige of it's a COVID era program where maybe there is more of an argument for having a broader eligibility in the time of crisis like that. But yeah, if we want a sustainable program, we think it should be more targeted to those who need it the most. We've said treat it basically like Lifeline. Replace Lifeline with a voucher program, similar eligibility requirements, with a $30 a month voucher that can be used, make it as flexible as possible, trying to put the money into consumers' hands and say, use this for whatever kind of broadband you want, and then say to ISPs, look, the money's out there. If you can create a service that people are willing to buy, that they think is worth their voucher, you can get it, rather than doing what we do now with deployment subsidies and say, we're gonna pay to deploy a network, whether anyone uses it or not. And I think that putting consumers in the driver's seat of this kind of program is going to be better all around.
Let's turn the topic a little bit. Part of your portfolio, spectrum. Mm-hmm. Congress just enacted spectrum obligations on the agencies, both the FCC and the NTIA, and then expanded auction authority to the FCC. Where do you envision, as you look at this, how easily can both the FCC and NTIA identify bands, and are there bands that you're focused on that you see as being ideal for reallocation to new commercial wireless services? Yeah, it's a very interesting time in spectrum because getting more capacity for commercial use is really important, but finding which band to do it in has been very difficult. I think the fact that it ended up in the reconciliation package was the result of some behind-the-scenes negotiation of some of this. So I'm hopeful that some of the gridlock has perhaps been worked out before that bill was passed.
But also, the bill excludes some of the bands that were thought to be like the most attractive places for commercial use. And so it is going to be tough to hit the capacity that the legislation requires with the bands that are available. I know that there's been a lot of talk about the CBRS band being ripe for reconsideration under this, that in 3.5 gigahertz. And then the top of the 6 gigahertz band could be another one where other countries around the world have used part of that for 5G and part of it for unlicensed, and maybe the U.S. should think about that as well. I think there's serious policy and legal concerns with both of those. I'm interested in it. I don't really have a strong opinion on which way we should go. I think it's going to have to be, the FCC and NTIA working together, and we're interested in, looking and participating in those proceedings to see, our overall goal is how can the spectrum be used productively. It's more important than even the auction revenue, is how do we get this spectrum into the marketplace so that it can be used by commercial users and ultimately by consumers, because that's where the real value of spectrum comes from. The value of, the 5G economy, the value of Wi-Fi is far greater than anything that you're going to get in an auction one time in the Treasury. What
you didn't mention upper C-band 2.0, or what is your take on the use of that band? The statute does identify and sets kind of parameters, at least a minimum amount in some regards. How do you see that playing out?
Yeah, I think that there certainly will be, well, I don't know, it's dangerous to say certainly, but I think that it's likely that we will see more commercial use there. There's a lot of complexities there coming from, both the fact that the mobile industry is interested in it as well as the satellite industry. We're interested in seeing if there's ways that you can sort of expand the definition of flexible use and say, well, why should we have a separate license for terrestrial, mobile, and satellite? And just say, it's flexible means flexible. Whoever has this can use it for satellite or mobile or whatever you like. We've sort of put that idea into the FCC record and are interested in seeing where that goes. But then, of course, the altimeters for the airlines is the other complication there. And so in some ways this is deja vu from the lower part of the C-band, where the airlines have altimeters that are really, really old, have receivers that really were built to operate outside of their assigned band, and then have a lot of resistance to upgrading those to make them actually compliant with the way that they should be operating. If we can end up in a situation where we have really high quality receivers for airplane altimeters, and then also have that then enables more 5G, more commercial use closer to the band edge, I think that's the best of both worlds for both, the mobile industry and mobile customers, and for airline safety. That it's the aviation industry should have an interest in saying we want our receivers to be really resilient. We don't want it to be the case that anyone and everyone with a cell phone could interfere with our receivers. And so taking some responsibility and saying, because we care about safety, we want to volunteer and have higher quality receivers. I think that's where they should be going.
Is there, there has been talk of a huge GAR band, and that you would need in a C-band 2.0 formulation. But as you're describing it, we should be able to. Is there any reason why we should not be able to, have if a GAR band, if anything, is at the minimal as possible? I mean, does it have something that some suggested 75 megahertz? I mean, that just seems like a high number from without my data point. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think it should be as small as possible. I mean, ultimately, it's a matter of the technology, but it's also a matter of the political will. If you have airlines that are going to sit there and say, no, we don't want to change. We want to keep our receivers, and that all of spectrum policy has to wait for the lifespan of an airplane, which is 30 years or something, then that's going to be bad for everyone, both air travel and for the mobile industry as well. And so I think I always like it when the engineers solve our policy problems for us, that if we could come up with filters or some sort of retrofit for the altimeters so that we both get really resilient altimeters that can operate and be really good neighbors to the folks in the spectrum band next door, that's really the best of both worlds.
One of the noticeable things about the spectrum provisions and reconciliation is they decide some things, but a lot of the policy is shifted to the FCC and NTIA. Does that cause you concern, or are you more comfortable with experts at the agencies deciding some of these things versus the Congress?
Yeah, I do think that probably the FCC is the right place to be making a lot of these decisions. It's especially for a spectrum where there's not really any greenfield spectrum left. There's always incumbent interests here that need to be worked out. Both, that's sort of both an economic and technical and legal questions that require several rounds of back and forth usually. The FCC has a lot of engineers who are really well equipped to analyze these questions, and that, making them there with a lot of evidence in the record and that kind of thing is going to lead to probably better outcomes than if we try to say we're going to set everything in Congress and then hope it all plays out well into the future.
Is the agency built? We have a diminished number of commissioners. Does that cause any heartburn for you, or doesn't matter at all?
I mean, I think it matters. I think probably the staff that's most important in this is going to be OET. That we always say that getting the engineers together in the room, the more we can have worked out by engineers in a room before the lawyers get in there, the better. And so, insofar as they're able to look at the tech specs of everything that's out there, or everything that could be out there, and try to find the most productive solution, I think that is going to be important. I'm not sure exactly what the staff, I know there's been a lot of staff turnover at the FCC recently, but keeping, especially the engineers staffed is going to be really important.
One of the priorities of FCC Chairman Carr has been Build America, the actual deployment itself. How do you make that process easier? Do you examine those issues as part of your portfolio? How can you make deployment decisions how can companies actually build networks easier? What are the barriers to deployment from states, locals, historical preservation? There's lots of different things that pop their head up to make the broadband networks more expensive or delay deployment. What are your thoughts on what the chairman's trying to do and the overall goal of simplifying or easing that process?
Yeah, I think that it's really important. I think especially you mentioned the state and local stuff, that's it gets less attention because it's in smaller in any individual case, but it adds up over when you're trying to do a nationwide network deployment. And so there are a lot of things, the fees that get charged at every step of the way to access a right-of-way, to be able to dig up a sidewalk or something like that. And also just the time that it takes when you're dealing with states and localities who maybe don't have the staff or who are, trying to be a stick in the mud for one reason or another, that is going to delay service, and time is money in a lot of these cases. And so I think it's really important to have, streamlining at every level of that. The environmental stuff is also really important. The FCC right now is looking at its NEPA processes to say, for wireless deployments, how much of this should we, under the statute, actually be subjecting to a really time-consuming and costly review process, and how much of it should just be you have your license, go deploy pursuant to your license. And I think that's going to be a really important process. And there's also a lot of this that is on federal lands. And so there's a role for Congress in that as well. So it is there's always room to streamline deployments, and ultimately the cheaper it is, the more streamlined and cheaper it is to deploy, the more service we're going to get out to consumers, and the more consumers will get faster service sooner.
One last question. As you're looking out there, what's one issue that maybe people aren't focused on today that you're spending time on it, or you see in the horizon as a future issue that people should be looking at? The telecom or the technology space in your portfolio?
Yeah, I would say we recently did a report looking at broadband convergence, which is something people have talked about for a while, but I think we're really seeing it bear fruit now, where we have, I guess from a technological perspective, fixed wireless and satellite are on the scene, as well as traditional cable and fiber providers have been building out more and more and competing with each other. We now have these whole new layers of competition that are been put on top of that. And so we're entering a time of really extreme competition, I think, which is really beneficial to consumers. It's also a time where we're probably going to see more mergers, and I think that's policies that enable us to create more efficient broadband companies is going to be really important. And then also looking at what are the policy issues that would block the benefits of this convergence. I look at, for a lot of these things like satellite and fixed wireless, spectrum is a bottleneck for a lot of those, that we don't want to be in a situation in which we could be getting more competition, more service to more areas, but for the fact that we're out of spectrum. And so looking at how to get more commercial spectrum for those uses is also going to be really important. And that's as much as just every industry always wants more spectrum, but it's also a overall broadband market competition issue as well.
Your answer gave me a thought of something that's been interesting. BEAD is likely to fund a number of companies, some of them small, some of them medium, and we're going to have a broad portfolio of different sized companies in the future that have many received these subsidies to keep a functionality. At some point, do you see huge consolidation in the broadband space for the reasons of getting scale and being able to service all of these different customers that they're now building networks to?
Yeah, I do think that the competition is really going to squeeze everyone to be as efficient as possible, and there are efficiency gains to be had from scale. And so I do think on the margin we're going to see the greater returns to scale is going to push people to consolidate more. And I do think there should be policymakers should be receptive to that, because ultimately that is good for consumers.
Well, I can't thank you enough for your insight on these very important issues.
Yeah.
Look forward
Thanks
to
for
talking
having
in
me.
the future. Thanks so much.
Thank you.